Good morning, ISACA South Africa members and guests. I hope you've had your first cup of coffee for the day and you're ready to go. My name is Arlene Lynn Valmink and I'm the president of the ISACA South Africa chapter. The chapter is proud to host the next webinar in our Directors Share campaign. The objective of our online campaign is twofold. Number one, to showcase the knowledge and expertise of the chapter's board of directors and leaders. The chapter's leaders are experts in their respective fields, whether it may be IT risk, IT governance, IT audit, or IT security. And secondly, it's to provide value to members during a period when most members find themselves at home, possibly in isolation, and engaging online. Offering online educational events has been the ambition of the chapter for a very long time. And in these unfortunate and unprecedented times of COVID-19, we have fast-tracked this service offering to members at no cost. Today, in the comfort of your homes, you'll listen to Sanjay Charavanapavan, who is our ISACA South Africa Education and Certifications Coordinator and currently serves on the board of directors. He is also the Managing Director at Excellenta. Please use this opportunity to learn and engage on the topic of application security, specifically during a system development lifecycle. I hope you enjoy this webinar today. Sanjay, over to you.
Thank you so much, Arlene. Really appreciate the introduction. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, so we're going to talk today about establishing security in your SDLC. And that's your development lifecycle. So just as background, when we talk about development, we're really talking about development in the broad context. So that's both in terms of whether you're doing commercial application, implementation of commercial applications, or whether you're actually custom coding applications. This is still relevant. This entire presentation is covering that entire topic in broad. And we're going to cover it from a perspective of governance, risk, and security. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple of things today. I'm going to start off by positioning firstly, digital and bimodal, and you may or may not be aware of these concepts, but we'll just spend a bit of time just talking about and positioning some of these things and the relevance to the development world. Then we'll talk a little bit about how do you mature your development capability, okay, and what's that all about, and what are some insights and hopefully some golden nuggets around what to do in that space. And then lastly, we'll talk about what it means to look at it from a security, risk, and governance perspective within the SDLC. What are the typical challenges with that, and what needs to be done? And then finally, we'll end with some recommendations. Okay. So some key challenges as context is, the problem space really is about this, right? It's about how does IT governance and risk stay relevant in a fast evolving digital world? So the world, is moving very quickly, development practices moving very quickly, and we're sometimes catching up, to be honest. And then what constitutes a modern, effective strategy for governance, risk, and security in projects? So when you think about development projects, how do we ensure that whatever we're doing is actually relevant, from a development project perspective? And then lastly is the skills and capabilities that are needed to make this work, not just within the development world itself, but certainly within our risk teams, our governance teams, and our security teams as well. Okay. So from a digital and bimodal perspective, the economic landscape is changing, right? I think with our current global lockdowns, wherever you are within the borders of South Africa, we're currently on a 21-day lockdown, 1 week into it, thank goodness, but 2 weeks to go. And globally, we're in different phases of lockdown, and that's having an impact in terms of our global economies, and it'll continue to have an impact certainly for the better part of this year, and into the next potential year, 2 years, right? Economic forecasts are already indicating that we will probably be in a global depression of sort for the second quarter, potentially maybe even into third quarter this year. Okay, that's going to have an impact on everything, on certainly in terms of our business, in terms of what we focus on, in terms of creating more pressure around how we develop and how do we do IT, right? And also certainly from a risk, security, and governance perspective. Plus, the digital disruption is underway, right? So we can see it right now, and I would say that we're actually in the middle of a digital disruption. So if you think about it, and I say this in jest, but people are saying, well, what accelerated your digital strategy, as an organization? And they're saying, is it the CIO? Is it the CEO? Is it whatever? And people are saying in jest, it's actually the coronavirus. And in reality, organizations have shifted in the last 2 weeks from being trying to figure out what to do with obviously global lockdowns, to now embracing digital platforms. People are working from home, and people are finding new ways of doing business. Ecosystems are changing, and that's going to have a major disruptive force on how we do business in the coming years. If you look at Gartner, Gartner is talking about a couple of different choices and ways to deal with the disruption that we're facing. And you can either deny it, or you could accept it and deal with it and find a way to accommodate that disruption. And they're talking about new partnerships and ecosystems that are going to come about as a result of this, in terms of supply chains, in terms of ways of doing business, in terms of systems and applications, in terms of cloud strategies. The disruption is going to have a significant and lasting effect on how we do business. If you look at Gartner's predictions for 2020 and beyond, there are a number of things that were already predicted at the start of this year, and I believe these predictions will only accelerate and potentially change going forward based on the disruptions that we're seeing already. Okay. So that brings us to the context of what's called bimodal, and you might have heard of this, but this is a concept that Gartner has indicated, which is different ways of doing development, in terms of your traditional approach, which is your mode 1, which is your typical linear waterfall-based development lifecycle, and that's still relevant for things like your systems of record. All right, I think I should be back. Just confirm if all that's good. Cool. All right, so sorry about that. Slight technology problems. So mode 2 is really around developing faster. So it's creating the need for the business to try and come up with something in the next couple of weeks, in the next couple of months, around mobile, around web portals, around cloud platforms. So they're desperate to develop faster, and unfortunately sometimes on legacy platforms. So that's where the challenge is really for IT as a whole, and obviously the challenge for governance, risk, and compliance is to make sure that, one, we enable that, because it's really essential that we support the business in that drive, but at the same time do it safely, and ensure that we're not creating additional risk or exposures that are potentially going to create a severe downside for the organization. So that's the challenge. It's a challenge that everyone in the industry is dealing with, and we need to be able to rise up to that challenge and figure out how we can do that as best as possible. In terms of budgetary spend, we'll see that between 2010, what was being spent on traditional methods of doing things was much higher. I mean, over 90% of budget was being spent on systems of record, traditional delivery methods, versus now and going forward, we'll see a drastic acceleration and change and shifts of budget to spend on systems of innovation, as opposed to systems of record, and even systems of differentiation. So these are little components. So it could be B2B components, it could be B2C components. Take an example, a loyalty system for an organization, a system. So if you think about, in our South African context, vitality, what vitality is to discovery, what momentum multiply is to the momentum group, what the loyalty platform of Woolworths is to the Woolworths group. It's those kind of things are part of that whole frictionless method. I mean, if you look at just in South Africa, we have 4 digital banks that have launched last year and into this year. One of the banks is actually built on a blockchain platform, and with one of the banks, Time Bank specifically, you could walk into a retail store, Pick n Pay, and walk out with a bank account and a card printed in your name within 15 minutes. That's how quickly that process works, and in a retail store as well. So there is a drive, and that drive is going to only accelerate in the coming times. Just a little bit more about Bimodal. So mode 1 is concerned with persistence, robustness, compliance, and core security and stability. So it's what we know as your traditional methods of development. Mode 2 is more exploratory. It's all about the user. It's all about the user experience, and trying to provide information and frictionless business, engagement with the user, utilizing many of the core products and services that an organization already has. In some cases, they're developing new products and services, obviously, and pushing those into the mode 2 delivery method. Okay. So there's a lot of information on this. I won't go into this in too much more detail, but just a bit of context in terms of what's happening, both in terms of the digital world and in terms of Bimodal, and the key challenge. So I think the thing to understand here is that it's not necessarily always a clear cut between mode 1 and mode 2. It's sometimes a development, there are phases of development, and in some development activities, you'll find some systems being built in a mode 2 world, and some systems being built in a mode 1 world. So a lot of this is evolving, and different organizations are coming up with different overall development frameworks that enable them to do this. Okay, so what does this mean for your development capability from a security, risk, and governance perspective? So the first piece is around vulnerabilities, right? And research shows that we are still creating a significant amount of vulnerabilities, okay? And if you think about it, a lot of the security industry, a lot of the risk management industry, is built around this problem, right? A lot of the practices or a lot of the tools. In fact, if we never created vulnerabilities in the systems we developed, to a large extent, many of us wouldn't have a job, right? So that's the funny thing or strange or ironic thing in this whole thing. But the reality is we are creating vulnerabilities on a daily basis in the systems we developed. And we track a metric called flaw persistence, which says the time it takes to identify a vulnerability once in production, and the period it takes for us to resolve that vulnerability once in production. And the statistics show that that time is it takes a long time to actually fix those vulnerabilities. And sometimes it takes years to actually fix it. And because of the interconnectedness of platforms in terms of the money it takes to fix those vulnerabilities, to stand up development teams again, and effort and etc. And oftentimes the business just doesn't have the appetite to do that. So that's a reality in that space. And obviously what we want to try and do is reduce those vulnerabilities during the development cycle itself. Some statistics in this space, if you're not familiar with what vulnerabilities actually look like, that's an example. It's quite a current example of vulnerabilities at the bottom there, or within the SAP world. So just to let you know that there are vulnerabilities that are on commercial applications itself, and the vulnerabilities that are tracked globally through CVS scores and the like are around commercial applications, obviously. So obviously, what goes out into these databases is not the vulnerabilities that are intrinsic to your environment, based on custom applications that you've developed, or unique environmental conditions based on infrastructure and setups of your databases and applications and the like. Okay, so this is only tracking either endpoint applications, commercial applications, and infrastructure systems. Now, an interesting thing is that there's a tracking in terms of vulnerabilities around what we call a CVS score. So obviously, the higher score, the more critical the vulnerability is. And then we also track on something called exploit price. And what's the market price of vulnerabilities? Now, this is a bit of it's just a value that's placed on what's the demand in the underworld for these exploits, and what are people prepared to pay for these exploits, especially zero-day exploits. Now, in this tracking and the research that's been done, last year, the value of the exploits was at about $227 million. That's what people were prepared to pay or paid for these exploits. And the tracking so far in 2020, we just through one quarter is $54 million. Okay, so this is real. And the vulnerabilities are real. The underworld marketplace is very real, and people are. There's a lot of interested groups looking for how to attack organizations. With the current lockdowns globally and people using digital platforms like this very one we're using now, there's a huge increase in attacks. Phishing campaigns are on the rise and the like as well. Okay, right. So what do we do about this from a development perspective? Well, so firstly, we've got to come up with a strategy, right? And one of the strategies is to create a targeting based on complexity of vulnerabilities, and to, in other words, create buckets and say, well, there are certain things that are very easy to do, there are some things that are moderate to do, and there are some things that are really hard to do. And you need to try and figure out what the best way to create that strategy is. But this is an example of it. So in other words, you can say, there are some of the vulnerabilities like, missing TLS or security headers, poor authentication methods, the use of the passing of credentials in clear text. I mean, those are quite easy to fix those things and to detect those things. There are some stuff like your standard OWASP, top 10, top 20 type of vulnerabilities are moderately easy to fix. And obviously we want to put some focus on that as well. And there are some things that are a little bit more difficult to deal with. And so we need to come up with a strategy on how to deal with those as well. So one of the options of doing this is for example, to do, to identify default controls. And those are the things in dark blue. So what we could say is, well, the easy things we want to try and fix by default, a large number of them, okay? So what we want to do is ensure that our standard development patterns, our standard development methods, our libraries, our standard ways of doing development in terms of coding practices, to a large extent deal with a lot of the issues at default, okay? And then we want to use some tools to find the other issues that are both easy and medium. Now, the thinking is that, or the general research belief is that if the automated tools don't really find the very hard and complex issues, and so we need to use more advanced methods to deal with the more harder issues. But we want to certainly use those tools to find the issues in both the easy and the medium category. Then we want to do things like bug bounty programs. You might be familiar with this, but this is it's used in many organizations. It's used, in the global world as well, where you motivate people within your organization and even externally for systems that you have externally exposed, to find vulnerabilities and come to you with those vulnerabilities in exchange for a reward, obviously, right? And so those bug bounty programs are effective in motivating people to find issues. And this is not even security people; it could just be IT users and etc. To motivating them to find problems and issues and come to you with them and hopefully find solutions with you as well to those problems, and obviously get some sort of a reward. And then the second last one is penetration testing. And what you want to do is employ both internal and external pen testing techniques to pick up those issues and resolve them. And the very last one is runtime monitoring. Obviously, we want to try and avoid the runtime monitoring as much as possible. What that is saying, well, once something is in production already, then let's look for what is wrong. Let's find those vulnerabilities through active infrastructure vulnerability scanning and application vulnerability scanning. Now, there is a distinction between those two, by the way. Your standard infrastructure vulnerability scanning tools, which most of your organizations probably have, don't obviously pick up application specific vulnerabilities. They might pick up certain vulnerabilities in commercial applications, mostly endpoint applications, but even some commercial applications, like I showed you before on the SAP vulnerabilities. But they obviously don't have the ability to look at your source code and look within applications and look for specific vulnerabilities around application logic, around actual things like issues like segregation of duties or any kind of other logic or rule-based problems in the way your systems are built. Okay, so your monitoring techniques actually have to be quite advanced to be able to find those problems in production and mitigate them as soon as possible. Well, some takeaways are: solve as many of your problems with secure defaults, use automated tools, but understand that they won't solve all of your problems. So you're not going to pick up everything with the automated tools, but certainly use them. Apply bug bounty programs, because they have been found to be very effective. Use penetration testing for the hard problems, but remember, penetration testing is expensive. So gear it to picking up the really hard problems that you're not going to pick up otherwise, and solve them. Now, the scoping and the way you structure your penetration testing is very important, because if you just run a test for the sake of testing, penetration tests, in our experience, 99% of the time will find the problem, but they don't always go into detail in finding the most difficult problems. The testers will generally find the easiest problems that they could find and present you with them. So you do need to think about how you scope your pen testing carefully to get the maximum value out of that. And then lastly, around runtime monitoring, as I mentioned as well. Okay. The next thing that you do want to employ within your development practice is threat modeling. Okay. Now, threat modeling, in my belief and experience, is an essential practice for cybersecurity, but it's a practice that just isn't being used across most of the organizations I'm liaising with. The dev teams I'm liaising with, they're not aware of these threat modeling techniques, one, and two, they're certainly not employing them. Typically, wherever threat modeling is being used is in what's referred to as red teaming exercises, where you bring in specialist companies to perform a threat modeling activity around your overall enterprise or around a specific part of your environment, and identify threats to specific target environments like your payment systems or your core business processes or the like. Okay. Now, once again, very effective in that. Those techniques are very effective, but the challenge is those techniques are not understood and applied within the development world. And my belief is that they should be, and so one needs to try and find the best method and use those methods in what you're doing. Now, I've shown here a method based on it's called PASTA, the process for attack simulation and threat analysis. There's a couple of others, by the way, as well. There's about at least 9 different threat modeling methods out there. The other one that's reused quite a bit is a method called DREAD. It's quite similar to the PASTA method, and it's largely employed by Microsoft. There's a tool available from Microsoft as well for that. So effectively what it is it's thinking like an attacker, and there's a whole method around identifying what are your data flows, what are your use cases, what's happening within your application, what are the interconnected world, environment of your application, and identifying, the different attack vectors, if it were, and the actors that could perform those attacks, and what could be the result of those attacks if successful. Okay. So that's just the whole method. It's really essential that the dev teams have some assistance from both risk and security practitioners in doing this, because it's a little bit complicated. But once they've understood how to follow this, this would be very useful, because this will help them to actually identify where the real risks and threats are, and then apply the right mitigating practice, as opposed to the normal methods of doing this, which, normal reviews and risk reviews and the likes, which tend to be a little bit more superficial, if I had to be honest, around identifying issues. So this really provides a lot more focus in terms of identifying really where the key issues are, and the main thing is to then embed that practice and thinking both in the development teams and in terms of the various supporting risk governance and security practices as well. And then The other piece that's really essential in this is tool sets, right? So it's really important that you have a good DevOps tool set and process. Now, that means that even if you're not following a strict DevOps process in your development practice, it's still useful to have a good security tool set and a standardized security tool set, okay? The reason why is that without a good tool set, it's really hard to do some of the things that we're talking about, right, on a very practical level. I mean, if you're sitting with an application, a commercial application, where you needed to perform SAST and DAST testing of a build environment, without automated security testing tools, it's quite challenging to get that done. And if you're sitting with a custom developed application, to be able to analyze the code, it could be several thousand lines of code, in that application, and to eyeball that and to analyze that manually is literally almost impossible. I mean, and certainly to be able to do it from a security perspective, analyzing code from a good coding practice is one thing, and that can, to some extent, can be done maybe manually. But analyzing it from a security vulnerability perspective is hard. And once again, going back to the scale that I showed you earlier, at best you'll be able to find some of the easy ones, but you're certainly not going to find the moderate or the hard ones. So having a good tool and a good tool set is really essential. Plus, what you want to be doing is actually linking to all the existing, or preferably a standard set of development tools as well. In other words, what's the developer ID environment? Are they using Visual Studios? Are they using IntelliJ? What are they using from a development practice perspective? And what insight does security and risk have into those tool sets, and what's going on in those ID environments? What are your source code management tools? I mean, are you using Git? Are you using SVN, Visual Studios, etc.? And once again, how well is the source code managed? And what insight do you have into that? Directly being able to access that and see what do you have good SQL methods in place around externally developed source code and the like as well. And then in terms of your build environments, same thing. You want to be linking into your build environments as well, into your testing environments, into your bug tracking environments. If you're using Jira for tracking, for example, of requirements and bugs, you need to have insight into that, and obviously link your tools into that as well. So that's sort of a view architecturally of what you need to have from a toolset perspective, and have solid tools that help your development teams to do this better. And then what you want to do is ensure that your development teams have capability in all the things that we're talking about. Okay, so the things that I've mentioned are, in some cases, the developers have a good handle on these things, but the work that we've done in this space shows that in many cases the maturity is quite low. Okay, so what you want to be doing is apply a maturity method to actually identify and benchmark where your development teams are in this process. Okay, so what you want to do is assess their capability, use that assessment to produce a benchmark of where they are against where they should be, using a scale, and you could even do a peer comparison if you need to as well. And then you need to produce a roadmap, right? You need to work with your development teams to help them improve their capability over a period of time. And typically those roadmaps might be a 2-year, 3-year life cycle, where you take a progressive approach on improving capability within the development community. To do this, You could use either the SAM or the BSIM methods. There are two frameworks out there that do this really well. There are a couple others as well, but I would recommend using either SAM or BSIM. SAM, for example, works in four main areas: governance, construction, verification, and operation. It breaks it down into 12 practice areas, everything from strategic metrics right through to testing and environmental management in production as well. Okay, so it covers the end-to-end life cycle of a development practice, and it ensures that in each of the areas there's good practice knowledge and application of the right practices from a security perspective, and the frameworks provide really good detail around what's required, how to apply it, and how to manage it and create assurance around those as well. So there are clear metrics and clear activities that have to be performed to mature from one level to the next. And obviously, from a governance perspective, that can be tracked. If you're applying an overall COBIT, for example, model like a COBIT 2019, that can be your overarching framework, underpinned by a framework such as SAM or BSIM that can then help you implement the right processes, the right controls, the right metrics, the right assurance methods, and the reporting on that as well. Okay, so next we'll go through specifically around governance, risk, and security. And the issue in risk, for example, is that the traditional methods aren't really relevant to application development and cybersecurity. So if you look at your traditional security risk frameworks, IT risk frameworks rather, they don't really, and the tools that are being used as well within the various corporates, what I find in general, and this is a bit of a generalization, is that a lot of the frameworks themselves are fairly generic around measuring and managing overall risk within the enterprise. And even the tools, assessment tools, are geared to the same. So they're not really geared to assessing application development during an application development lifecycle. Secondly, a lot of the frameworks and the related tools don't relate to cybersecurity. So in other words, the threat modeling I just spoke about, those methods and the techniques around use case to abuse case analysis, around application perimeter analysis, around detailed risk analysis within an application environment, the methods and tools just aren't there traditionally. Okay, now there are some resources available from ISACA, and there are some practices available around this, and I would really urge the risk practitioners to look into this a little bit more, dependent on what you've currently got. I mean, if you've got good practice in the space, then fantastic, but if not, I would really urge the risk practitioners to look into this a little bit more and come up with specific cyber risk frameworks and specific tools and methods around assessing risk from an application development perspective. Okay, the next one is around security in your SDLC. So from a governance perspective, traditionally security isn't well established in the development process. And I would say that there has to be a formal method and a formal process on defining and establishing security in your SDLC. And an example is shown in the picture below, where from requirements, and this, by the way, is completely agnostic to whatever development method is used, whether you're using Agile or waterfall, any kind of development practice, the requirements are the same, right? And they can apply. So whether you're creating user stories in Agile, or you're developing, traditional waterfall-based sequential activities, you need to come up with a set of requirements specific to security. We're interested in the design, and knowing what that design, the implications of the design from a threat perspective and an architecture perspective. We want to be involved in the development lifecycle, whether it's for a commercial application or a custom application build, and from unit analysis, right through to final testing. We want to be involved in the testing process as well. Obviously, unit testing is part of your development activity, and you want to be employing code reviews, security code reviews at that stage already. So that life cycle and the process and the requirements and the checks and gates are essential. Obviously, if it's agile mode 2 type development activities, one has to ensure that the whole process accommodates that and aligns to bimodal development. And another really important piece is to move accountability into the business areas, into the development teams, and enable them to employ these methods and processes within their existing activities as much as possible. So that's an essential part of it as well, and ensure that they have the right tools and the processes and the methods of getting this done. And an interesting way to look at this is that cybersecurity is the safety management cost of doing digital business, right? So I'll just explain that a little bit. Now, if you're going into a traditional construction, right, you're building a 10-story building, it goes without question or even second thought that your builders need to wear a hard hat, they need to wear safety equipment, they need to follow certain safety procedures on the building site, and there are a number of building checks and balances that are performed during a traditional construction activity. Engineers are involved in checking the usage of steel, the structural strength of concrete, and the like. Okay, so it's so well embedded into those practices that it's not even questioned or thought about, right? It's just followed, and that's really what we want to try and establish from a security perspective. Is that one, it's well understood, well embedded. There's clear accountability around it, and the business also understands that it's actually just a cost of doing business. It's an essential part of doing business, and they're just going to get on with it. Okay, so that's really our target of what we want to achieve in this, and we've got to employ a number of different techniques and methods to get that done. Then from a governance perspective, what we want to do is right size our governance to enable agility, right? I think across the board, across all organizations, there is a need and a drive to being more agile. Even if you're not doing full on bimodal, there is definitely a need to be more agile. And usually there's a conflict with traditional governance. So, Gartner, for example, have come up with some interesting material around some adaptive frameworks in this space. ISACA also have some really great stuff around governance techniques and methods, and the use even within the practice of COVID 2019. There's a lot of practices and methods that can be used to fit within an agile governance world. And there's a lot of thinking in this space around how to do this better as well. So I would really urge governance practitioners to understand, what's going on, from from a bimodal perspective, from a digital perspective, and ensure that they've adapted their governance techniques to suit the organization appropriately as well. Okay. Now, one of those things is, for example, is ensuring that right from the beginning, there is well-defined and well-understood techniques of doing this. Okay. And for example, in bimodal, it's a concept of understanding security debt and ensuring that that debt is paid for upfront or paid for forward into the project. What that means is debt, that is security debt or IT or technology debt, is actually the cost of making bad decisions. Okay, if you think about it. So what that means is it's understanding that to be able to move very quickly and sometimes develop at pace, some bad decisions are going to be made. Obviously, it's essential that practices and guardrails are put in place to limit that as much as possible and limit that risk. And that's why I was talking about all those other practices beforehand to be employed to mitigate and reduce that risk as much as possible. But there will still be things that will go wrong going forward as well. And it's essential to understand that, accept that, and put in the right methods to deal with that. Okay. And likewise, right through the process. So early on, there are certain things that need to be done. There are things that have to be done during build. And as things scale, because usually what happens in a more two-type development, there's a prototyping type effort where the business will prototype or try out certain things, and once they've figured out that this is actually going to be useful, to the clients or to the B2B customers or whoever the case is, whatever the case use case is, they will then scale it out. And so as those things scale, you need to have the right methods around that as well. Okay, so in summary, as we close, I know I've gone through a lot. There's a lot of content that we've covered, but really, if we have to take it down, it's a couple of things. One, it's to establish a program to mature your development capability, right? So what you want to do is ensure that your development capability, the actual team, the people, the developers, whether they're business analysts, whether they're testers, whether they're actual coders, architects, they need to have a certain skill set around what we're talking about, and to be able to take accountability, they need to understand what the practices is all about, and that's why this is really essential, that you have a formal program to do this. The next one is to improve your cyber risk practice, right? So employ good modern cyber methods in your risk and governance and security practices to ensure that you really considered cyber risk during your development lifecycle. Okay. The third one is to define a formal secure SDLC process, and it actually has to be defined in detail. So it's not good enough to just say, yeah, here's a couple of steps that we're going to follow within a normal development process. It really needs to be defined clearly so people know what's required, how they need to follow it, what are the guidelines, what are the standards, what are the patterns, how are they going to get this done properly. Okay. And then lastly is to establish the governance, accountability, and assurance methods in the right places. So remember, the aim is to push the accountability down into the business, down into the development teams, and down into the actual activities as much as possible. It's the most effective way of doing this. In other words, create the distributed environment as opposed to a centralized only capability that ends up becoming the bottleneck and the frustration for the development teams. So there are things that need to be done to make that happen, around policy changes, around the way you're doing governance, around a number of these practices to get that done practically. But that's certainly my recommendation. And you really want to shift thinking to help the business determine what not to do. that's really what we're trying to achieve to a large extent, is enable the business to a large large extent really understand what these things are, and for them to take on a level of accountability, and partner with the respective teams to get this done a little bit more effectively. So that's really, in summary, what I wanted to share. Thank you very much for attending today. I hope that was insightful. I hope that it left you with a couple of things to think about, and maybe take forward. So I would really urge you to just dwell on that a little bit. The slides will be made available on the ISACA portal. So you're welcome to go through that in your own time and reach out to me if you have any more questions. But yeah, I will pause for a bit, and just open up to some questions. If anyone's got some questions, you're welcome to put it onto the group chat, and I'll do my best to answer. So I've got a question from one of our members around how do we encourage and incentivize developers to do this when they've got the pressure of tight timelines. And that's a very good question, because that's the real contending factor, really. It's the time pressures of delivering quickly, especially in a bimodal agile type world, versus all the good practice objectives that we were just talking about. Well, the easiest way to do this, to be honest, is to push that accountability back into the business, right? Now, the traditional approach is you follow a gated review activity, and then the risk practitioners and the security practitioners will identify all the 215 things wrong with the way the application was developed, and will present the business or the dev teams with two options. And option one would be fix it, and option two is accept this risk register, this risk acceptance thing on this, and you live with the risk. Okay. Now, actually, that's not very effective, because it creates more frustration and animosity more than anything else. So what you want to do is help the business and the dev teams understand that it's their risk, right? They are ultimately accountable for that risk, and they need to deal with that at a business level, And once they understand that accountability a little bit more, and take accountability, then they're a little bit less inclined to push back on the advice that's given by risk and security practitioners. And that's a bit of a process to get that done in practice, but that's ultimately what you want to achieve, and you want to be able to work with them during the entire development process, not just at the end, because that's what creates all the frustration to the parties involved. Okay, I've got another question here, which says, how do you influence senior leadership that technical debt and remediation and weaknesses are a priority? So I think similarly to what I just talked about, you want to use good metrics, right? And the DevSecOps tools I talked about, which can do all the analysis of the vulnerabilities, the governance methods around being able to track at a granular level the vulnerabilities and the cost of remediation are all essential metrics. So you need to get the right data, to be honest, right across the development process and in production systems as well, and be able to present that data effectively to senior stakeholders. And by presenting that data, they can then have a better understanding of what the real issues are, and also have a better understanding on that at a business level, why they need to be paying more attention to this, and what they need to be doing about it. Okay. Now, to a real business stakeholder, they need to understand it in commercial terms. They need to understand it in risk management, and mitigation, terms, and understand the business case involved. So it's essential to present the information to them in that format so they can make the right decisions. It's another question around, can security reviews and testing be outsourced to drive down cost? Yes, absolutely. It can be, and it actually might be an optimal way of doing it, because sometimes to have specialists in employ to do this type of analysis and testing might be prohibitive for your environment, depending on the scale of development you're doing. So it might be more effective to outsource that, but certainly would encourage you to have a good outsourced provider to help you with that. Okay, and I've got another question. How does an IT auditor look at an outsourced development or system when the teams are not inside the organization? So yeah, very good question. And that really brings about a concept called third-party risk management and third-party development assurance as well. So yeah, it can be done, it should be done. There are methods, for example, there are two assurance methods, one called SOC 1, SOC 2. It used to be the previous derivative of the ISAE 3402, which are employed as assurance methods for external providers. So you can get your external development provider to comply to those requirements and give you the assurance and certification that they are using it. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time, so you're welcome to contact me with further questions, but I'm going to close the session just in terms of keeping to time. Thank you very much for attending. We had a great number of people attend that, so that was really great. Thank you for all the comments as well, really appreciate it, and really hope you have a super Friday. All the best with whatever you're dealing with around the coronavirus as well. We're all in this together, and I know we'll get through this. Have a super weekend, everybody. Thank you so much for joining.